junior doctor working in London. Last year, I graduated from the Queen's College, Oxford, where I spent 6 years studying medicine. When I was in year 12 and 13, I knew I wanted to apply to either Oxford or Cambridge, but I wasn't sure which university to apply to. Today, I'm going to give you some tips about how to make that decision and also some of the factors that I used when I was choosing between Oxford and Cambridge. Just a disclaimer before we get too far into the video that everyone is going to have their own opinions about which one is better. There's a lot of rivalry between the two universities, and of course I'm going to be biased when I say that Oxford is better. So here are some factors to consider when making the decision. Let's start by talking about entrance requirements. So one thing to look at when you're choosing between Oxford or Cambridge for a particular subject is the grade requirements for the same course in both universities. You may find that there's a difference. So for example, for medicine, in Oxford, the grade requirement is typically A star AA, whereas in Cambridge for medicine, the grade requirement is typically A star A star A. Now, that's not to say that Oxford is less academically rigorous than Cambridge, but it's just to say that Oxford and Cambridge place an emphasis on different parts of the application process, for example, required grades. But there are a lot of other steps in the process that they may consider differently, such as entrance tests, interviews, personal statement, written work, etc. But grade requirements are definitely something to think about when applying to university, because ultimately you do want to be able to achieve the grades and get in. So definitely check if there's any differences between the two courses and think about what is realistic for you. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the entrance exams. So when you apply to Oxford, you have to sit an entrance exam for most subjects, the scores of which will help towards your application and help towards determining whether you get invited for an interview. Now, for some courses, the exam that you have to sit is the same in Oxford or Cambridge. For example, for medicine, you have to sit the BMAT, which is the Biomedical Admissions Test. But that's not the case for every subject. For example, to study maths, you have to sit the Maths Aptitude Test for Oxford, but then you have to sit something called the STEP in Cambridge. So my advice would be to have a look at both the tests and maybe take a look at the past papers and what people have been saying about them and try to see which one plays better to your strengths. Another thing to consider is how much emphasis Oxford or Cambridge gives to certain parts of the application. For example, when it comes to studying English literature, in Cambridge, almost 90% of all applicants are invited to interview. This means that Cambridge used the interview as a tool to narrow down applications at quite an early part in the process. However, Oxford, for English literature, only interview around 60% of their candidates, and they use other things such as the scores from the admissions test, called the ELAT, and the personal statement and written work to narrow down their applicants first. There are lots of ways to interpret this, but essentially, if you get an interview at Oxford for English literature, you're further along the application process to the point where you're more likely to get in. Whereas if you get an interview for Cambridge, you're earlier in the application process because more people get interviewed. For example, you know that you perform much better in tests and on paper than you do in interviews. You might want to consider applying to Oxford because they use the interview much later on in the application process. So you know that by the time you get to interview, they're already seriously considering you as an applicant. Okay, so now it's time to move on to the academics. I think it's important to remember that regardless of what course you apply for, Oxford and Cambridge are generally very similar when it comes to academics and teaching styles. They're both very traditional universities that are academically rigorous and focus on research and learning things from first principles. They use a lot of similar teaching styles such as lectures, writing essays, doing problem sheets, and having regular small group teaching, which is called tutorials in Oxford and supervisions in Cambridge. That being said, there are subtle differences between the courses in either Oxford or Cambridge. Let's take modern languages such as French and Spanish as an example. So the Cambridge course for modern languages is thought to be more modern, with more emphasis on communication and culture, where you get the chance to study things such as films alongside literature. Whereas Oxford is considered more traditional, with much more emphasis on literature as well as speaking. So it depends on what you want from your education and how you want to apply your knowledge in these languages. Personally, I wouldn't sweat it too much when it comes to thinking about the academics, because as I said before, they are quite similar and the standard of education you'll get is very high at both. I wouldn't think too much about reputation. For example, which university is more well known for sciences or arts? I would say they're pretty good for everything. So use other factors when considering which university to choose. Okay, so another thing that we can think about is the cities themselves. So Oxford is a bigger city, is a generally more lively and bustling city in comparison to Cambridge. The good thing about Oxford is that it's not just a university, but it's a real city with other people living there, not just students. The good thing about this is that you can interact with a wide range of people and cultures, and it feels like you're living in a real city. On the other hand, Cambridge is a lot smaller and has more of a village or campus feel. Now, some people really enjoy this because it may feel more sheltered and they can feel like they're living in a university bubble, so it really depends on what you want. I would say though that when it comes to traditional architecture, cobblestone streets and old buildings, you'll get the same in Oxford and Cambridge. The aesthetics of the two universities are quite similar. So the next thing to consider is the people and the vibe of the two cities. I personally think that if you have the ability to, you should definitely go to the open days and check the universities out in person. This is personally what I did when I was considering Oxford or Cambridge in year 12. And so for me personally, when I went to the Cambridge and Oxford open days, it was one of the biggest things that helped me make my decision between Oxford or Cambridge and ultimately led to me choosing Oxford. So when I went to the Cambridge Open Day with my family, it may have just been me, but I got the feeling that the Cambridge students there were quite aloof and standoffish. Now, I only interacted with a few students from a few colleges, but this was the general impression that I got. I remember seeing that in one college, all the students who were doing tours were wearing t-shirts that said, "This is a real-life Cambridge student" on. I just thought that this felt a little bit stuck up, and therefore it tainted my whole experience of the city. Now, I'm not saying that Oxford people aren't stuck up, but when I went to the Oxford Open Day, I got a much more friendly and open vibe from the students and the faculty that I met there. So it really just helped solidify the decision for me. One thing I definitely was thinking about when I was applying was the diversity of the two cities and whether I would fit in as a brown girl. When it comes to diversity, I definitely think that the universities in bigger cities, such as unis in London, are definitely better for diversity. That being said, in Oxford I met quite a lot of students from different parts of the world, and I definitely think the student body is quite diverse. Definitely not as much as other universities in London, but which was quite different from the experience that I had at school. That being said, I do think that the faculty in Oxford lacks diversity. This was my experience in medicine, but I'm sure that the same can be said for Cambridge as well. It's a well-known fact that Oxford and Cambridge have a lot of work to do when it comes to diversity. So I've given you a lot of factors that you can consider when choosing between Oxford or Cambridge. In some aspects, it is a strategic decision, so you have to think about where you'll be most likely to get in, and by that I mean which university focuses more on what your strengths are, for example, interviews or written tests. Ultimately, I don't think it's that big a decision because the two universities are so similar. I think the question that you really need to ask yourself isn't whether you want to go to Oxford or Cambridge, but whether you want to go to Oxford as a whole, because it's a very unique and specific type of university which is very traditional, very academically rigorous. And yes, there are lots of benefits of going to Oxford or Cambridge, but it's not always easy and it does come with its own set of pros and cons. So that's just something to think about. If you want to know more, I talk a lot about my experience of Oxford in some other videos, so go and check them out. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one.